You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line is Philip Giraldi. Phil, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
I saw an article online, How I Got Fired, Exposing Jewish Power in America Has Real Consequences. It's a shocking story, and I want to get into that in great detail in a moment. But before we do, for the benefit of the listeners who don't know who you are, I know tons of people do, and that's a good thing. But for the benefit of the new listeners or people who are just new to this truth movement, could you give them a little bit of background about who you are?
Yeah, sure. I'm born in New Jersey, educated at the University of Chicago, and later on at the University of London for graduate study. I served in the United States Army Intelligence during the Vietnam War. After graduate school, I went into the CIA, where I became an operations officer. That's one of the CIA officers who works overseas with agents. I did that for 17 years. After that, I have been involved in the private sector and most recently writing for several websites and magazines about national security issues and most particularly about the war on terror.
Phil, what about the Council for the National Interest? Are you still actively involved in that?
Yeah, the Council for the National Interest is an organization that's been around for over 30 years now. It was originally founded by former U.S. diplomats who were, to put it mildly, outraged by the U.S. policy in the Middle East, which was favoring Israel very heavily and damaging our other interests in the region. So the Council for the National Interest has been around with the objective of changing U.S. policy to make it more aligned with U.S. interests and less with Israeli interests. I'm the executive director of CNI right now and have been so for 7 years.
Basically, that was the point of the article you wrote, pretty much. I read the whole thing. It was a great article, as usual. I love reading your stuff. And I read your article, and then I read the article that you wrote. Is it pronounced UN's Review?
UN's Review.
I read that as well. For the benefit of the listeners again, the American Conservative magazine, I might be wrong, but you've been writing for them since their inception?
Pretty much. I started writing for them shortly after they came into being. That was back at the end of 2002, so I've been writing for them for 15 years. The article I wrote about being fired appeared on uns.com, and the original article that it referred to, which was about American Jews pushing the United States into new wars, also appeared in uns. So the American Conservative is another website that I have been writing for 15 years, and they are the people that fired me.
So in other words, the article you wrote on UNS was picked up by the American Conservative, or they posted it because you wrote it?
No, they didn't post it. They merely discovered it and noticed it and didn't like it. And I received a call from the editor about 2 days after it came out telling me that it was completely unacceptable by their standards, and as a result, they were terminating their relationship with me. As I mentioned, the article was about what I was describing as Jewish power, the ability of Jewish groups and individuals to distort our foreign policy in the Middle East to benefit Israel and to the damage of the United States. And I think what set these people off was the fact that I didn't use a euphemism about who these people were. I said that they were Jewish, and very often you'll see people writing about the Middle East policies, and they'll use expressions like the Israel lobby or Zionists or neoconservatives. But these are all kind of fudging the basic issue. The basic issue is that this is Jewish money. This is Jewish people with access to the political class and with lots of money and creating these foundations and organizations that only exist to benefit the Jewish state. So I said, well, what is it when you cannot call a spade here? That it's Jewish groups and individuals, not all Jews by any means, but I was indicting these people by name. I mentioned who they were and what the organizations were. These organizations are, as far as I'm concerned, committing treason.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess, as you said in one of the articles that, I guess it was probably the one we were explaining about being fired, was that the American Conservative, unless I read it incorrectly, one of the founders was Pat Buchanan, and one of his articles about Jewish power was very popular, and they never said anything about that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's the irony of this whole thing. Pat Buchanan became famous or infamous, depending on how you want to look at it, when he wrote an article denouncing the war in Iraq, saying, whose war? And in my piece on getting fired, I actually quoted from the article he wrote, and he basically said the same thing that I did. And so here we have the irony of the guy who founded the magazine 15 years ago, and here I'm continuing the tradition of asking the same questions he was asking, and I get fired for it.
My question would be then, Phil, what's happened in the time that Buchanan wrote that and now?
I think what has happened is that everybody in the publishing industry, which has changed dramatically in the past 15, 20 years, is scrambling for the same dollars, looking for money to survive. And I suspect what's happened with the American Conservative, like many other publications, is they have to basically triangulate where their money is coming from, and they move towards what they think is the center. And that means that views that are even quite legitimate, which I feel my viewpoint was, are considered to be too dangerous and too risky. And in this case, it was too dangerous and too risky even to have me around.
And I guess Valerie Plame found out about that as well. Why don't you tell the listeners about what happened to her?
Yeah, this is an interesting sort of side story. Valerie Plame is a former CIA officer like myself. She's best known for involvement with her husband, Joe Wilson, who was in Niger to see if Iraq was buying uranium. This was before, obviously, the war against Iraq. And he came back and saying, no way, this had never happened. And when he did that, he was punished, but his wife was punished worse. She was a serving CIA officer undercover, and Scooter Libby, who was an advisor to Vice President Cheney and an ardent Zionist, I might add, was so angered by this that he leaked her name and identity to the media, the Washington Post, which picked up on it. So she was punished. And she has been punished again because she made the mistake of seeing my article online and reading it and then making a comment that it was interesting material. She got jumped on by all and sundry of the Jewish oligarchy in the media, and she apologized repeatedly, but they didn't let up on her for a whole week. I suspect that the fact that she got into this story, and the story then made national news, was what made the story have the kind of currency that it got. I think if she had not been involved, my story would have been like other articles that I've written where people will say, he's just another crackpot, he's an anti-Israeli crackpot.
An anti-Jew or anti-Semite. They don't really say anti-Jew. They say anti-Semite, which of course, as I've explained over and over again, is so ridiculous because Semite refers to the Semitic languages that were around in the 1770s, and they're not Semites. They're from Lithuania, Poland. We're not even allowed to talk about that. Helen Thomas found out about that.
Yeah.
I love both of your articles, but you bring up the point that we should label when these people are promoting the interests of a foreign nation over our own country. We can see what happens when somebody, i.e. Trump, promotes the interest of our own country, what the media does to him. Is there a problem with putting a disclaimer, like you mentioned, on the television or in newspapers or on the internet that say, warning, these people might be related to the country that they're promoting over the United States?
Yeah, actually, I made two proposals. That was one of them. I said, look, if you've got a guy like Bill Kristol, leading neoconservative and great lover of Israel, on television, and he's talking about the Middle East and Middle East policy, it might be nice to have a label underneath to tell people that are listening that don't know about him that this is a guy who's partisan. And it was kind of a lighthearted comment because I knew this was never going to happen. But I immediately got jumped on by the usual crowd like Alan Dershowitz for this outrageous anti-Semitic slur. And the other proposal I made was that for Jewish officials in the government who were involved with policy making, I said, well, look, if you're Jewish and you have strong feelings about Israel, when the issue of what the policy should be in Syria or in Iran or in Israel, you should recuse yourself, just like a judge would do in a trial in which he had a personal interest. It seemed to make extremely good sense to me to suggest that. And, of course, I got bombed for that one, too.
They would say something like, well, that's like forcing Jews to wear the star on their arm. I mean, that's basically how they have made it so convoluted that you can't, and you bring this up in your articles, that you can't criticize them. And that's the problem. Now, here's what you say in your last paragraph. You said, when all is said and done, the punishment that has been meted out to me and Valerie Plame proves my point. The friends of Israel rule by coercion, intimidation, and through fear. If we suffer through a catastrophic war with Iran, fought to placate Benjamin Netanyahu, many people might begin to ask why. But identifying the real cause would involve criticism of what some American Jews have been doing, which is not only fraught with consequences, but is something that also will possibly become illegal thanks to congressional attempts to criminalize such activity. I know what you're talking about. I'm laughing because it's insane. We Americans will stand by mutely as we begin to wonder what has happened to our country. And some who are more perceptive will even begin to ask why a tiny client state has been allowed to manipulate and bring ruin on the world's only superpower. Unfortunately, at that point, it will be too late to do anything about it. This is very important, Phil, because they snuffed your voice out at TAC completely. The guy called you up, like you said, and he said, you're done. You're finished, even though the article, as you explained, had nothing to do with TAC, the American Conservative. We're at a point here now where they snuff out your voice. Already no one else dares talk about it. You're one of the big heavyweights who has been able to cross the line between the alternative media and the established media. Are we in deep doo-doo now, Phil?
Well, it depends on what comes next. I've had a lot of calls from friends and people who actually I didn't even know telling me that, look, it's about time that we change the way we think and talk about this issue, because there clearly is a superbly well-organized and funded cabal out there which is doing a lot of damage to the United States. So we have to talk clearly about what this means. And so I've had a lot of encouragement, but the problem is that when you lose a major platform like the American Conservative has been for me, well, it's hard to make up for that. It means I'm right now in the process of looking at some other sites that have offered me the ability to post there. But I want to have a site that's right, that basically is sensible and essentially permits a serious discussion about these issues. So, yeah, we're in danger, because I think the example of what happened to me will keep anyone else from crossing that line and using what I refer to as the J word. And I think a lot of people have already figured that out. Mearsheimer and Walt's book on the Israel lobby, for example, does use the word quite a bit, but it's always very careful, and it wraps around it the Israel lobby concept as a group that includes Christian Zionists and others too. It kind of skates around the issue that the money, the power, the access is all Jewish.
That's where the 600 or 800 or 8,000 or 1 million pound gorilla comes in, that if we're not allowed to talk about the reality of the situation in real terms, then how are we ever going to get out of it? Like you said in that last paragraph, it's going to be too late, because they're not going to let us talk about it. Right now they're taking away monuments, they're erasing history, they're really creating a blank slate here for people coming into the game where they don't know where we were. And if they don't know where we were, then how are we going to get to where we need to get in order to make sure that we don't end up in Armageddon? But the good news is that you're getting coverage for it. Like you said, the article has already been read. I think it was something like, at the time you wrote your article about being fired, it was 130,000 views plus about 1,300 comments. Do you have an update on how many times that article's been viewed?
Yeah, it's been viewed about 150,000 times. This is the original article, and the comments are up to about 1,500. The second article has had about 60,000 views, and I think it just broke 1,000 in terms of comments. And some of my older articles also found a new readership as a result and are approaching 50,000 views. So it certainly had a dramatic impact in terms of getting the message out. And the point you made about the criticism of Jews and Israel becoming illegal, people might think this is an exaggeration, but it ain't. There is legislation in Congress and there's legislation at state levels making it impossible to criticize Israel or to criticize the behavior of Jewish groups. And in some cases at universities, it's become actually already impossible to make these kinds of critiques. I had a lunch yesterday with a university professor, and he told me his tale. He teaches a course in international relations, and as part of the syllabus, he had an article that was talking about the Middle East, and the author of the article, this was not him, it was the author of the article, had a comment about Israel and its neighbors, and the comment was essentially that Israel has very strict immigration laws, but Jewish Americans who support Israel want open immigration in the United States. So the article was basically saying there's a contradiction in the way Jewish supporters of Israel see the world. And this professor was admonished for being an anti-Semite and was almost fired as a result. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on.
It's chilling, and it's a dream come true for somebody like Alan Dershowitz. One last thing, besides the fact that Valerie Plame, as you said in your article, the fact that she promoted the article, I think that was via Twitter, and pushed it around, and then, of course, you have to genuflect to the powers that be, and you have to apologize. It's always, the first apology is never good enough. They make sure that you'll keep apologizing so people know. But you're also getting more attention now. Have any other established media outlets contacted you about this?
Well, that's an interesting one. The short answer is no. No established mainstream type outlets have gotten in touch with me, even though the story has been all over the place. It was in the Washington Post, it was in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, it was everywhere. It was on MSNBC, CNN. but nobody has gotten in touch with me to talk about this. However, from the alternative media, I've been run off my feet in terms of doing interviews, in terms of talking about what this all means. There are a lot of people out there interested in this story and interested in what this means. And unfortunately, we are seeing the classic exploitation of the heavy Jewish presence, overrepresentation in the media and entertainment industries to make sure these kinds of stories don't get out. How long they're going to be able to do that, I don't know. I've long felt that what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians and also to all their neighbors is totally indefensible. So how long do you keep this fiction going? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
I wish I did too. Phil Giraldi, Phil, I want to thank you so much for the time you spent explaining all this to the listeners. It's always a great honor to speak with you. And thank you again for everything you do, everything you've done for the United States. I appreciate it. I know that many of the listeners do, if not all of them. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again real soon.
Thank you.